Well, it's Tuesday again.
Right.
And we're still doing scales and gauges, and in fact, we're still doing O scale.
Right.
Anyway, while we were in St. George, we went to visit our friend Jim Harper again there in the St. George area as part of the Color Country Model Railroad Open House.
Right.
And he models Proto 48.
Oh, he does a good job too.
Oh, doesn't he? And so we're going to let him do a little explaining here on exactly why he chose to do Proto 48 and how, to a large extent, these guys owe their scale and gauge to the people who were doing narrow gauge that forced the issue of actually changing the gauge to an appropriate size, and the wheels and flanges. And
Right.
Well, first of all, there were people in the O gauge genre a long time ago, like in the 50s and the 60s, and they wanted to correct the track gauge for the scale of a 1/4 inch. And in 1940, when the NMRA did the standards for O gauge, they adopted 1 1/4 as their track gauge, and then they modeled everything with 1/4 inch to the foot, just because of the convenience of using, we didn't use metric at that time. So there was a problem there, and there were several ways to create the correct track gauge for the 1/4 inch scale. But they continued using 1 1/4 as a track gauge, which if you scale it out, it's a 5-foot gauge, and there's no 5-foot gauge trackage in the U.S. So there were a few guys that said, well, if I'm going to model a highly detailed locomotive or car, whatever I'm doing, I want it to be prototypical all the way, so I'll just narrow the track down from 1.250 to 1.177. So they started narrowing the track gauge down to the correct for the scale, so 1.177, and they called it AAR fine scale, and it lasted that way until the National O-Scale Convention in 1986 was in Burlingame, California, and we got together with the manufacturers there who wanted to know what we wanted as them manufacture as far as locomotives and cars and so forth with the correct track gauge on the wheels. So we kind of borrowed the terminology from the English, which they used a proto scale usage over there, and we just call it, well, it's 48 to the foot, so we made it Proto 48. And the NMRA set up a committee, engineering committee, to make the standards for the fine scale, you might say, of Proto 48. And they had set up a system on computer. You could take any scale you wanted and put it in a computer, and you could get the correct track gauge for that scale. It got the entire industry thinking about, well, if I'm going to model a certain scale, what gauge am I going to use? Am I going to use a toy train gauge, or am I going to use a manufactured O gauge or G gauge, or what? So you can look at that chart in the NMRA standards, and you can find out what your gauge should be for your scale you're using. Or if you go the other way, if you got your gauge you want to use, what scale should I use it with? Am I going to use it for 3-foot gauge, or 4 feet 8.5 inches, or 5 foot? When I moved to Reno in 1980, I fell in with some people there that were doing the fine scale and 1/4 inch scale. So they had the correct gauge, 1.177. So they gave me a module, and we had a modular layout there in the Reno area. It was 12 by 38, and it was all fine scale.
So brass engines had to be modified.
Yes. You either had to do it yourself, or you had to buy like a Glacier Park engine, where they provided wheel sets for Proto 48 if you wanted to change them out. So my Southern Pacific Mike Mikado out there has a wheel set that was changed out to Proto 48 from the same locomotive they're selling as O gauge. If you want interchangeability with a club that's close by, then you probably will end up with whatever they have, whether it's exactly the right gauge for the scale you're using or otherwise. Well, when you look at the gauge for the scale you're in, if you're in 1/4 inch scale, if you're modeling 2-foot gauge railroad, you've got a 1/2 inch. That's 2 times 1/4 inch. So if you're doing 3-foot gauge, it's 3 times 1/4 inch, and you got your 3-foot gauge. So they were already operating on the correct gauge for their scale. So they didn't have to change a thing. And also their wheel contours and their trackage had to be the right configuration to actually operate correctly. You could not interchange an O gauge train to the Proto 48 or the 48 to the foot narrow gauge of 3 foot, because the frogs and the other track work problems were designed for O gauge, and they had larger flanges and wider wheels, so they really couldn't interchange. But by using the correct scale and gauge relationship, they could operate whatever you wanted together. In my own case, if I was going to build a highly detailed locomotive, it was not my desire to put out of scale, out of gauge wheels on it. I'm going to go with the full scale wheels and track gauge.
What's available commercially when you're doing
commercially now? Well, I designed, I had track products made because I had to hand lay my track. So I had masters made for the frogs, the guardrails, and the points. And I had a caster over in California to cast them up for me. So I sold them in my High Sierra Models hobby shop all over the world. There are people all over the world that wanted to use those. And there was some interchangeability. I had my masters made in code 125 rail. That's 125 inches, 0.125. And then they had code 100, which was the common rail for HO. And each one of these represents a different rail weight on the rail railroad, so you can choose whatever weight trackage you want. And so we called it Proto 48, and it's been that way ever since. Manufacturers now, you have track products, you've got people that do wheel sets, you have some people that make wheel sets extra for a locomotive. So if you buy an O-gauge locomotive, you can buy the Proto 48 wheel set to change it out. Or in my case, I had a lathe, I started turning the wheels down and moving them in to where I wanted them, and doing all that thing. But as it over the years, then it's graduated to the point where there's more Proto 48 stuff available right directly from the manufacturers.
Well, anyway, Proto 48, or fine scale, AAR, fine scale, anyway, whatever they used to call it. Proto 48.
Yeah, that's easier to remember.
Which is, you're not going to find very many railroads modeled in Proto 48, but they're sure beautiful when you do run into them. And a handful of them have actually been built as dual gauge railroads in both 3-foot gauge and 4 feet, 8.5 inch. Which is possible to do because of the standards that they're following.
Right.
Where otherwise it's not really possible to do it in O scale.
Not even.
Confusing?
A little bit.
A little bit, but not too confusing. Anyway, if you're not a subscriber, please be a subscriber. It helps the YouTube algorithm to find you, to find us, to find us, to find you. And it all starts by you subscribing to the channel, which doesn't cost a darn thing.
No.
It's just a way of informing the system that you liked the video, and the thumbs up also helps with that as well. Anyway, the easy way to become a subscriber is by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Right
up there.
Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Sunday with some of that foolishness. We'll see you then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.